Imagine, just for a second, a wall of water.
Right.
And not just a big wave, but a wall of water 6 miles wide. And it hits in the dead of night.
Yeah.
By the time the sun comes up, this water has, like, entirely erased towns. It's ripped up the actual geography.
Completely reshaped the map.
Exactly. And it leaves up to, well, the estimates say up to 250,000 people dead.
Which is just a staggering number.
It's mind-blowing. And yet, if you look in the history books today, or, if you just search your own memory, if you're listening to this, you will probably find absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are cracking open a set of production notes and some script excerpts too, right?
Yeah, from a documentary pitch.
Right, from a historical documentary series pitch. It's titled Echoes of the Past, Episode 18, The Iron Dam. And our mission today, the whole goal of this deep dive, is to really extract the most crucial insights from this document about a completely hidden modern catastrophe.
And it really is hidden.
It is. We are dissecting a disaster that was, well, built by pure hubris. It was predicted by this lone expert, triggered by a total freak of nature.
A massive storm.
Yeah. And then, the craziest part, it was buried by a massive 3-decade state cover-up. So joining me to kind of, navigate this massive historical blind spot is our resident expert.
Hello. And, I am genuinely fascinated by the sheer scale of the erasure here.
Yeah, the cover-up.
Right. Because what we are looking at from these sources, it isn't just the mechanics of a dam failing. We're looking at the mechanics of an authoritarian cover-up.
Wow.
The themes in these production notes, the suppression of inconvenient data, the terrifying danger of, prioritizing optics over physical safety. These aren't just artifacts of 1975.
No, not at all.
They're incredibly modern vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. So to really understand how a disaster of this magnitude even gets off the ground, we kind of have to look at the soil it was built in, right?
We do. We have to go back.
Back to the 1950s. We're in Henan Province, central China, specifically the Ru River Valley.
Right. And this is, the dawn of the People's Republic of China, moving really rapidly into the ideological fervor of the Great Leap Forward.
Yes, that context is everything here.
The government launches this massive construction boom. It's called Harness the Huai River. And when the notes say massive, they really mean a frenzy.
A total frenzy.
Over 100 dams were thrown up in this one specific region in just a few short years.
Yeah, and if you're listening, you have to view this through the lens of that specific era's mindset.
Right.
This was not like a carefully phased infrastructure rollout. This was, well, the sources describe it as an ideological war. And the enemy was nature.
Man versus nature.
Exactly. The Huai River Basin had this really long, brutal history of flooding. So the new political regime, they needed to prove their superiority by conquering the river once and for all.
Oh, I see.
So the metric for success, and this is key, it wasn't careful flood control. It wasn't sustainable irrigation.
Okay, so what was it?
The state-mandated metric was simply, quote, retaining more water. Okay, wait, let's unpack this. I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of that metric. Are we talking about just, hoarding water behind a wall just to hit a quota?
Precisely. That's exactly it.
Wow.
Retaining water became the physical, undeniable proof of your revolutionary zeal.
That is wild.
If your dam held back a massive reservoir, you were demonstrating your dedication to the cause. You were succeeding. The higher the water, the higher your political standing with the central government.
That feels incredibly dangerous. If you are listening to this and you've ever worked in, say, a corporate environment with those really toxic productivity metrics, you know exactly how this plays out.
Yeah.
It's like judging a software engineer entirely by the sheer volume of code they write in 24 hours, right? Regardless of whether that code is full of bugs or if it's literally going to crash the entire server the second it goes live. Yeah. You are incentivizing mass over function.
You're incentivizing total blindness to reality. Because you're building a physical system designed solely to look impressive on a political report.
Right.
And you're completely ignoring the underlying architecture.
Right.
And this leads us directly to the fatal flaws that were baked into the Banqiao Dam from literally day one.
Okay, so let's talk about the dam itself.
Right. So this was an earthen dam.
Wait, I always assumed massive dams from this era were just giant walls of poured concrete, like the Hoover Dam or something. How does an earthen dam actually work? Is it literally just a giant pile of dirt blocking a river?
Well, basically, yes.
Yeah.
An earthen dam is essentially a massive, carefully engineered hill.
Uh-huh.
You don't use concrete for the main structure. You use local materials.
Okay.
You lay down a highly impermeable core, usually made of packed clay, to stop the water from seeping through, and then you pile hundreds of thousands of tons of compacted earth and rock on either side of that core to give it weight.
So it's about sheer mass.
Right, weight and structural stability.
Yeah.
And when they're built correctly, with deep geological surveys and decades of historical flow data, they are incredibly strong.
But they didn't have that here.
No. In the 1950s, in Henan, they didn't have decades of historical weather data. They were rushing. And furthermore, the notes point out they were relying heavily on Soviet engineering guidance.
Okay, but Soviet engineering in the 1950s was highly respected, wasn't it? Like, why does the document flag that as a fatal flaw?
Because of geography.
Geography.
Yeah. The Soviet engineers who advised on these projects, they were bringing templates that were designed for the Russian landscape.
Oh.
Right. And Russian river systems like the Volga or the Ob, they generally experience slow, predictable spring snowmelts.
Ah, okay, so it's a gradual buildup.
Exactly. So the dams built there were designed to capture and hold that slow melt for year-round irrigation and, hydroelectric power.
Yeah.
The primary design goal was storage.
Which perfectly fits that retain more water metric.
It does. But the Huai River Basin in central China is a completely different beast. It is subject to the Pacific monsoon season
Oh, boy.
and violent, sudden typhoons.
So the Chinese engineers took a blueprint designed for a slow, gentle snowmelt and just slapped it onto a river system that occasionally gets hit by catastrophic tropical storms.
Exactly. The Soviet guidance dangerously prioritized water storage over flood discharge capabilities.
They didn't think about how to get the water out.
Right. They built the walls high to keep the water in, but they vastly underestimated the capacity needed to let the water out quickly in an emergency.
Wow.
And the physical reality of building a massive earthen dam so quickly with these mismatched engineering blueprints and totally incomplete data, it meant that structural problems appeared almost immediately.
Like cracks.
Yeah, cracks started showing up in the Banqiao Dam very early in its lifespan.
And you would think, right, that a crack in a brand new dam would be a massive red flag,
Yeah.
but the notes say they just patch the cracks.
Just patch them right up.
And this detail from the notes is just staggering to me. After patching these early glaring structural warnings, the officials actually gave the dam a nickname. They officially dubbed it the Iron Dam.
Yeah, an earthen structure built hastily,
Yeah.
already showing signs of severe structural stress, patched up, and officially branded as mathematically unbreakable.
I am really struggling to understand the psychology there. If the dam is cracking, how does it earn the nickname the Iron Dam? Isn't that just like putting a PR spin on a glaring physical warning?
It is, and this is where we see this terrifying rule emerge from the sources. We can call it the Iron Dam paradox.
Okay, what is that?
The louder a system insists it is infallible, the fewer actual safety nets it possesses.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The nickname wasn't a description of its metallurgical makeup. It's dirt, right?
Right, it's mud and rocks.
It was a description of its political importance. The state had decreed that this dam was a monumental success of the revolution. Therefore, by definition, it was invincible. To point out the cracks or to, suggest it was unsafe, that wasn't viewed as an engineering critique. It was viewed as treason.
It's turning infrastructure into a religious symbol. If the state is flawless, the dam has to be flawless.
And that created a horrifying false sense of security. The source notes really highlight that this illusion of invincibility actively increased the eventual death toll.
Because the people living downstream actually believed the PR spin.
Millions of people. They slept soundly in the valleys below. They expanded their farms into the natural floodplains.
Because they thought they were safe.
They built their homes and their communities in the direct shadow of this massive artificial lake, all because they had been told with absolute, unquestionable state authority that the Iron Dam could never fail.
They thought the river was conquered.
Exactly. There was no need to fear the water anymore.
I mean, a system that prioritizes politics over physics is just on a collision course with reality. Physics doesn't care about your political slogans.
It really doesn't.
Water pressure doesn't care about your revolutionary zeal. And this direct conflict between the political narrative and the physical reality, it brings us to the one man in the notes who actually understood the math.
Yes. And the narrative really shifts here. It moves from this abstract institutional failure to a very specific, deeply frustrating personal tragedy. because there was an expert who saw the physical reality clearly.
Okay, let's bring in Chen Jing. According to the production notes, he was one of China's foremost hydrologists at the time.
Yes.
He wasn't a political figure, he was a scientist, an engineer. He looked at this massive dam building binge during the Great Leap Forward, and he was absolutely horrified.
Because he was looking at the hydrology, not the ideology.
Right.
He openly criticized the campaign. He warned that throwing up over 100 dams so close together on a single river system was just a recipe for a cascading catastrophe.
A domino effect.
Exactly. If one dam failed, the sudden influx of water would overwhelm the next one and the next one. But his most urgent, most specific warning was about the Banqiao Dam itself.
Because he looked at the blueprints and saw that Soviet flaw. The notes say Chen explicitly stated that the design of the Banqiao Dam completely lacked the capacity to release water in the event of a severe flood.
Yeah, he ran the calculations for the river valley. He factored in the potential for heavy monsoon rains, which everyone knew happened there. And he realized the discharge capacity was mathematically insufficient.
It just couldn't vent fast enough.
If a massive storm hit, the water coming into the reservoir would vastly exceed the water they could let out.
And he didn't just complain about it. He provided a solution. The notes are very clear on his recommendation. Chen insisted they needed 12 sluice gates for emergency discharge.
Right. And just to be clear, a sluice gate is a controllable opening in the dam.
Like a giant valve.
Exactly. If the water level rises to a critical point where it might spill over the top of the dam,
Right.
which we will discuss later is the absolute worst-case scenario for an earthen dam.
Right.
You open the sluice gates, it lets the water rush out safely through a concrete spillway, relieving the pressure on the earthen walls. Chen's math dictated that 12 of these massive doors were the absolute bare minimum required to safely vent the reservoir during a major storm.
12 gates. But the officials running the project, the people utterly obsessed with that retaining more water metric we talked about, they looked at Chen's 12 gates and deemed them, quote, too conservative.
Yeah.
They thought 12 gates was an excess of caution, like a waste of resources that could be better spent building more dams somewhere else. So they slashed the number, they cut it from 12 down to 5.
5 gates. Less than half of what the leading hydrological expert in the country said was the minimum requirement for basic safety.
I am just trying to wrap my head around the recklessness of that decision. It's like an airline auditing their safety equipment and deciding to pack only enough parachutes or life vests for like 40% of the passengers.
Wow, yeah.
Just because carrying the full amount is deemed, excessively pessimistic, you are actively betting the lives of everyone downstream that you will never, ever experience an emergency.
And in the political climate of the Great Leap Forward, excess caution wasn't just seen as a budgetary waste. It was interpreted as ideological weakness.
Oh, right, because it implies the state might fail.
Exactly. Because Chen Cheng insisted on the math of 12 gates, because he refused to back down on the safety requirements, he was officially branded a right-wing opportunist.
Wow. They turned a mathematical disagreement into a political crime.
He was treated as an enemy of the state. He was completely removed from the project.
The same.
The man trying to save their lives was purged for being insufficiently enthusiastic about the dam's invincibility.
Let me ask you a question, though. Why does an excess of caution threaten a political regime so deeply? Is it simply because acknowledging a potential failure of the dam means acknowledging a potential flaw in the leadership itself?
You've hit the nail on the head. Systems that rely on a narrative of absolute infallibility fundamentally cannot compute risk management.
Because risk implies flaw.
Right. Risk management, by its very definition, requires you to imagine failure. It requires you to sit down and say, what if the thing we built isn't perfect? What if nature is stronger than our engineering?
Yeah.
To admit that the iron dam might actually need 12 safety gates to prevent it from collapsing is to admit that the iron dam is vulnerable. And admitting vulnerability in that specific era of Chinese history was politically terminal.
So they chose the comforting political lie of 5 gates over the uncomfortable physical truth of 12.
They did.
And what makes this so agonizing is that Chen wasn't just purged once. The notes reveal this maddening pattern. Later on, when new problems arose with the river system, the state quietly brought Chen back.
Because they needed him.
Right. He looked at the situation, he warned them again about the compounding dangers, and then they purged him again.
He was trapped in this cycle of, Cassandra-like foresight. He could see the disaster coming with perfect mathematical clarity, but he was forbidden from stopping it.
And while he was being politically exiled, Physics was just quietly, methodically doing its work inside the Banqiao Reservoir.
Which brings us to a really terrifying mechanical detail from the notes.
Yeah, the silt. The notes mention that over the years, silt began quietly clogging up the mere 5 gates they did install. How exactly does that happen? Does dirt just, float into the gates?
Well, it has to do with water velocity.
Okay.
A river naturally carries tons of suspended sediment, mud, sand, clay, right?
Sure.
And as long as the river is flowing currently, that sediment stays suspended in the current. It's moving. But when you build a dam and stop the river to create a massive stagnant reservoir, the water velocity drops to near zero.
Oh, so the dirt just falls out of the water.
Exactly. Without the energy of the current to keep the particles suspended, all that sediment slowly drops to the bottom. Over a decade, that silt accumulates, and it doesn't just rest there like fluffy sand. The immense weight of the water above compresses it into a thick, concrete-like mud.
Oh.
And because they were so obsessed with retaining water, they rarely opened the 5 gates to flush the system.
Because opening the gates lowers the water level, which hurts their political quota.
Right, so the sediment just piled up directly against the inside of the dam, physically burying the lower halves of the few gates they had.
So when they cut the design from 12 gates to 5, they didn't even maintain the 5. They had 5 partially buried, compromised gates.
The ideological rejection of sound science had compounding physical consequences. By allowing those 5 gates to become severely silted, they reduced their already razor-thin margin of error to near zero.
The math that Chen Jing warned about, the lack of discharge capacity, it wasn't a theoretical debate anymore. It was a ticking time bomb built into the very foundation of the dam.
It was just sitting there waiting for a catalyst.
And that brings us to August 1975. The sky finally provides the water to test the math.
And it provided an astronomical amount of water.
Let's look at the trigger. August 5th and 6th, 1975. Typhoon Nina. The storm moves inland, it collides with a cold front, and does something a typhoon should never do.
It stalls.
It parks itself directly over Henan Province, directly over this massive, fragile network of Great Leap Forward dams.
The meteorology of this event is horrifying. Typhoons are massive engines of kinetic energy and oceanic moisture, right?
Yeah.
But they're designed to move. They dissipate that energy over a long track. By colliding with a stationary cold front, Typhoon Nina was essentially pinned in place.
Like it hit a wall?
Yes. It focused the entire moisture payload of a tropical cyclone onto one highly concentrated geographic bowl.
The notes state that the storm dropped roughly a year's worth of rain over a meter of water in just 24 hours.
Think about that.
A meter of rain in a single day.
The sheer physical weight and kinetic energy of that much water falling from the sky is almost impossible to visualize.
Well, the source notes provide this incredibly visceral detail that really helps paint the picture. It says the sheer force of the rain falling was so intense, so heavy, that witnesses on the ground described birds being beaten dead out of the sky.
That is just chilling.
Yeah.
If the rain is falling with enough velocity and density to physically crush a bird in midair, imagine what it is doing to the saturated ground.
Right.
Imagine what it is doing to the rivers, and more importantly, to the rapidly filling reservoirs.
The water level behind Banqiao begins to rise at a terrifying speed. And here is where the mechanical flaws and the administrative paralysis lock together into a death spiral.
It's procedural dread.
Truly. So the operators at the dam see the water rising. They know they need to let water out. So they try to open the gates.
The 5 partially silted gates.
Right. And they immediately discover that the water is coming in vastly faster than they can discharge it.
The math is failing exactly as Chen Jing predicted years earlier.
But then an entirely human element compounds the disaster. As the water is creeping up the earthen wall of the Banqiao Dam, the massive rainfall is already causing severe flooding downstream in the river valley.
Because of course it is. It's a meter of rain.
Right. So the officials downstream, who control the broader regional river management, send an order up to the Banqiao Dam operators.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
They forbid them from doing a full early release of water.
They explicitly ordered them to keep the gates closed to mitigate the localized flooding happening downstream.
I have to stop you there because that is absolute madness.
No.
If you're listening to this and wondering why no one just opened a valve, imagine a pressure cooker sitting on a blazing stove.
Okay.
The dial's in the red, the metal is groaning, you know it is going to violently explode in a matter of minutes. but you refuse to vent the steam because you don't want to get water spots on your kitchen counter.
Wow, yes.
You are so worried about managing a small mess that you completely ignore the fact that the entire pot is about to detonate and take the kitchen with it.
It is the ultimate manifestation of administrative paralysis. The downstream officials were trying to manage a localized standard flood crisis. They lacked the big picture visibility to realize that the anchor of their entire system was inches away from catastrophic failure.
So they doomed them both.
They handed the dam operators an impossible paradox.
Hmm.
You are forbidden to release water to save the downstream towns, while the water behind you rises to a fatal tipping point that will eventually destroy those exact same towns entirely.
Oh, wait, hang on. I want to push back on something here.
Sure.
The notes mention this was categorized as a 1,000-year storm. If it truly was a 1,000-year storm, a total meteorological freak event, wasn't the dam doomed anyway? Like, why are we blaming the 5 gates or the administrative delay? Wouldn't any dam have failed under a meter of rain in 24 hours?
That is a crucial question to ask, and the answer lies in the fundamental fragility of the design. Yes, Typhoon Nina was exceptional, but by cutting the discharge capacity from 12 gates to 5, and then allowing those 5 to silt up, they dramatically lowered the threshold for survival.
I see.
An earthen dam relies entirely on never being overtopped. If they had the 12 gates Chenjing designed, they could have vented massive volumes of water early in the storm.
Creating a buffer.
Exactly. Creating a buffer in the reservoir to absorb the peak rainfall. Because they couldn't vent it, the buffer vanished instantly.
Oh, wow.
A much smaller storm, a 100-year storm, or even a severe 50-year storm, hitting exactly right while the gates were silted and communication was delayed,
Oh.
it could have resulted in the exact same overtopping scenario.
So the storm just exposed the math faster.
Typhoon Nina was the catalyst, yes, but the weapon was the design flaw.
Man. And as this administrative nightmare is unfolding, the physical reality of the storm continues to dismantle their ability to even talk to each other.
The communication breakdown is horrific.
The procedural dread in these notes is suffocating. The dam's office floods, the phone lines short out and go dead. The operators are now entirely cut off from the regional weather stations.
They have no idea if the storm is moving on or getting worse.
The loss of communication severs the central nervous system of the entire region. They are flying blind in the middle of a hurricane.
And they try to send warning telegrams downstream, right?
Yeah, but the telegraph lines are down, or the messages arrive uselessly garbled, and the evacuation orders that do manage to go out are horribly fragmented.
It's chaos.
The notes describe a scenario where evacuation orders reach towns on one side of the river valley, but completely miss the towns on the opposite bank.
Oh my God.
Imagine being on the wrong side of that river. You're just sleeping in your bed, listening to the heavy rain, completely unaware that the town across the water from you is fleeing in absolute terror into the hills.
It's the compounding nature of systemic failure. Disasters are almost never caused by one single clean break. They are the result of a cascading chain of human errors, ignored warnings, and systemic blind spots all aligning at the worst possible moment.
Which brings us to midnight on August 8th. The communication is dead, the rain is still falling. The men at the Banqiao Dam are out in the pitch black, desperately piling sandbags on the crest of the dam.
It's a futile effort.
They are trying to literally build the earthen wall higher with their bare hands as the black water creeps up toward their boots. It is terrifying. But you cannot out-sandbag a year's worth of rain.
No, you can't. The physical threshold is finally crossed.
Let's walk through the timeline of the breach. Just after midnight, the nearby Shamantan Dam, part of the same interconnected Great Leap Forward network, fails first.
Right.
And then shortly after, at approximately 1:00 a.m., the water level behind the Banqiao Dam finally reaches the crest. The invincible iron dam is overtopped.
And to understand what happens next, we have to explain the mechanics of overtopping.
Please do.
When water flows over the top of a concrete dam, it's usually just a dramatic waterfall. The concrete holds. But an earthen dam is made of compacted soil.
Dirt.
Right. When water flows over the crest of an earthen dam, it doesn't just spill, it acts like a saw blade.
I've heard you use the sandcastle analogy for this before. It really clarified it for me.
Yeah, it's the best way to visualize it. Imagine you build a massive, tightly packed sandcastle on the beach, and you pour a bucket of water directly onto the top of it.
Okay.
The water doesn't just flow smoothly down the sides. It immediately carves a deep ravine right down the middle of the sand.
Right. It cuts right through.
Exactly. And as that water flows through the ravine, It drastically increases the pore water pressure inside the structure itself. It saturates the compacted dirt from the inside out, destroying its structural integrity.
Wow.
The dam doesn't just overflow, it rapidly unravels and consumes itself.
The notes say the Banqiao Dam was torn open from top to bottom in a matter of seconds.
A literal blink of an eye.
The earthen wall just dissolved. And what comes out of that breach is a wall of water 6 miles wide. 6 miles, or roughly 10 kilometers, across.
It's unfathomable.
And it is several stories high. It erupts from the reservoir and moves down the valley at the speed of a car, roughly 50 kilometers per hour, directly toward the sleeping plains below.
Let's dwell on the sheer physical physics of that for a moment.
Yeah.
A 6-mile wide wave moving at 50 kilometers per hour. Water is incredibly dense. 1 single cubic meter of water weighs a metric ton.
A ton.
We are talking about millions upon millions of tons of water moving with the kinetic energy of a freight train. When a wave like that hits a populated area, it isn't a flood.
No.
A flood is water rising in your living room. This is an inescapable wall of kinetic energy. It scours the earth down to the bedrock.
Wow.
Buildings, trees, bridges, entire villages, they are simply erased by the leading edge of that wave.
And because it's 1:00 a.m. and the phone lines failed and the telegrams never arrived, the vast majority of victims were completely unaware. They were asleep.
So tragic.
They had been told their whole lives by the state that the Iron Dam was an unbreakable triumph of the revolution. There were no sirens, there were no warning bells, there was just the roar of the water in the dark and then a 6-mile-wide battering ram.
The contrast between the extreme violence of the waves and the total vulnerability of the sleeping people is just devastating.
And the wave didn't dissipate after the first few towns. It acted as a battering ram moving down the entire river valley.
It's triggered a domino effect.
Yeah. The wave hits the next dam downstream, obliterates it, adds that reservoir's entire volume to the wave, and just keeps going. The notes say 62 downstream dams collapsed in a row that night.
62.
Let me ask you this. Were those 62 downstream dams doomed the moment Banqiao broke? Or is this exactly the systemic failure Chen Jing warned about?
It is the absolute realization of Chen Jing's warning.
He knew it.
Yes. The sudden release of the Banqiao Reservoir was always going to overwhelm the immediate downstream infrastructure. But the cascading failure of 62 dams is the result of building a fragile, interconnected system driven by quotas rather than engineering resilience.
Too many dams, too close together.
Exactly. When you build over 100 dams in a single region, prioritized by political zeal rather than geographical reality, you aren't building a safety network. You are lining up dominoes. The failure of the anchor dam compounded its own destructive energy with every subsequent dam it shattered.
The wave just got bigger and more lethal as it moved. It's an unimaginable level of destruction packed into a few dark hours.
But here's the part of the story that shifts the paradigm.
Yeah.
While the initial wave was horrific, the true scale of the horror and the part that makes the subsequent government cover-up so utterly damning is what happened when the wave finally dissipated. The sun came up and the water stopped moving.
This is a crucial pivot in the narrative. The kinetic event, the dramatic disaster is over. But the systemic tragedy, the grinding, slow death, is just beginning.
Exactly.
Okay, so the wave dissipates, the sun comes up. Let's look at the silent aftermath. In a normal disaster, this is when day 2 begins. This is when the helicopters arrive, the emergency sirens wail, and the state mobilizes to rescue the survivors.
Right.
But these 62 collapsing dams didn't just destroy towns, they took out the entire region's infrastructure. What does day 2 actually look like in Henan Province?
It looks like an apocalypse.
Wow.
The immediate death toll from the flood wave itself, that 6-mile-wide battering ram, was approximately 26,000 people.
Which is a staggering loss of life for a single night.
Unbelievable. But the geography of the basin meant that the floodwaters didn't just wash away into the ocean, the water pooled. It essentially created massive, stagnant inland seas overnight.
The isolation was absolute. The rail lines, the roads, the telegraph wires, they were all severed. The entire region was cut off from the rest of China.
Over 10 million people were directly affected by this event. But the most terrifying statistic in these notes is that over 1 million survivors were left completely stranded.
If you're listening, try to visualize this. 1 million people who survived the initial wave are now trapped. They are clinging to high ground, crowded onto rooftops that haven't collapsed, clinging to the branches of half-submerged trees.
Yeah.
And they are completely surrounded by vast expanses of stagnant, highly polluted floodwater.
And because the infrastructure was gone, the relief effort was paralyzed, it was late, and it was entirely inadequate.
Right.
You have 1 million people trapped under the August sun, relying on meager, sporadic airdrops of food just to survive another day.
And we have to talk about the physical reality of that water. It wasn't clean rainwater anymore.
No, not at all. The water they were surrounded by, the water they were eventually forced to interact with out of sheer desperation, was a toxic soup.
Oh,
It was heavily contaminated with the carcasses of tens of thousands of drowned livestock, human remains, the chemical runoff from destroyed factories, and raw sewage from dozens of erased towns.
the smell alone must have been unimaginable. The decay of an entire region baking in the summer heat.
It's a nightmare.
And when you have 1 million people trapped without clean drinking water, without sanitation, surrounded by that level of decay, the secondary catastrophe isn't possibility, it is a biological certainty.
Absolutely. Famine and waterborne epidemics rapidly swept through the survivor camps and the isolated rooftops. Diseases like dysentery and cholera thrive in exactly those conditions.
The cruel irony is staggering. You survived the most destructive, violent wave in human history. You survived the night, and then you slowly die of dehydration from dysentery while surrounded by millions of gallons of water.
This raises an important question, though, because this is where the death toll balloons into the realm of the incomprehensible.
Tell me the numbers.
The estimated death toll from starvation and disease in the weeks after the flood is roughly 145,000 additional people.
145,000 people died waiting for a rescue that never came.
Yes. And some independent estimates, combining the initial waves, the ensuing famine, and the epidemics, push the total death toll up to 230,000 to 240,000 dead.
That is just, I can't even...
This makes the Banqiao Dam collapse one of the deadliest structural failures in the history of human civilization.
Think about that ratio for a second. 26,000 people died in the initial flood. That is horrific. But nearly 6 times as many, over 140,000 people died afterward.
Yeah.
Doesn't that fundamentally reframe this event? It ceases to be just a natural disaster exacerbated by bad engineering. It becomes a purely administrative disaster.
It does.
It's like surviving a massive car crash on the highway only to realize the ambulance has been routed to the wrong city and you just bleed out on the asphalt. The failure to mount a massive immediate rescue killed vastly more people than the wall of water itself.
It absolutely reframes the narrative.
Yeah.
The failure of the dam was an engineering failure driven by political hubris. But the death of 145,000 people in the aftermath was a catastrophic failure of the state's basic obligation to its citizens.
Because they couldn't respond.
Right. It revealed an ideological system that was fundamentally incapable of handling the physical consequences of its own arrogance.
Which transitions us to what is arguably the most chilling part of this entire deep dive.
The erasure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because logic dictates that a disaster that kills 250,000 of your own citizens would fundamentally alter a nation. There would be a day of national mourning. There would be monuments erected in the valley. There would be sweeping public investigations, policy overhauls, and massive international appeals for aid.
You would think so.
But that is the exact opposite of what happened. Let's look at the cover-up.
This is where the story shifts from a tragedy of incompetence to a masterclass in active deliberate suppression. The Chinese government, under the leadership at the time, made a calculated decision to classify the entire disaster as a state secret.
A state secret. 240,000 people dead, an entire river valley reshaped, 62 dams wiped off the map, and they just dropped a classified stamp on it and moved on. How is that mechanically possible?
To understand how you hide 250,000 deaths, you have to look at the geopolitical context and the anatomy of authoritarian control.
Okay, set the scene.
It was 1975. The Cold War was ongoing, and China was in the throes of deep internal political struggles nearing the end of the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
To ask for the immense international help they desperately needed, the helicopters, the medical supplies, the food aid, would have required admitting to the global community that the Iron Dam had failed. It would mean admitting that the foundational infrastructure of the Great Leap Forward was fundamentally flawed and that hundreds of thousands of their citizens were currently dying of starvation.
So they looked at 1 million starving people, weighted against the public image of the state, and chose the image of the state. They chose silence over survival.
Exactly. There was no domestic news coverage detailing the true scale of the horror. The state mobilized the military not just for delayed relief, but to lock down the region.
To keep the information from getting out.
Right. They controlled the flow of information absolutely. Survivors were silenced or intimidated. Local histories were aggressively rewritten to minimize the event.
The true scale of the Banqiao disaster was literally locked in a drawer. The world didn't know. The citizens of other provinces within China didn't know.
It's hard to believe, but yes.
It was a staggering 30-year silence. The details only began to surface to the wider world gradually between the late 1980s and the early 2000s as records were declassified or leaked by human rights organizations.
Erasing an event of this magnitude requires a massive, deliberate, and terrifying coordination of silence. It is an administrative feat as massive as building the dam itself, but entirely focused on obscuring the truth.
And this cover-up is precisely why the death toll is still contested today. We mentioned the numbers range from the official direct deaths of 26,000 to independent estimates of 240,000.
Yes.
That massive gap, that uncertainty, isn't because historical records from 1975 are fuzzy. That uncertainty is the direct physical fingerprint of the cover-up itself.
It's evidence.
Exactly. When you refuse to allow independent journalists in, when you block international aid agencies, when you hide the hospital records and pave over the mass graves, you deliberately blur the math of the tragedy. The ambiguity is the goal.
The lack of a precise number is the lasting success of the state secrecy. But amidst all this darkness, the source notes provide a very bitter, incredibly poignant coda regarding our moral center, Chen Sheng.
Right. The hydrologist who did the math. The man who begged for 12 gates got 5, and was branded an enemy of the state and purged for his caution. What happened to him after the water receded?
In the horrific aftermath of the floods, with the river systems entirely destroyed and the valley in absolute ruins, the state realized they had a massive problem.
Naturally.
They needed to clear the rivers and rebuild the infrastructure, and they needed someone who actually understood the complex hydrology of the Wai River Basin. So they quietly brought Chen Jing back.
Oh my God. The system that punished him for being right desperately relied on him the very second he was proven right.
They reinstated him, and he did the grueling work to help repair the region. He spent years clearing the blockages and designing safer channels, but the notes make a very specific point to highlight that he never received a formal public apology from the state.
I am trying to find a metaphor for this level of institutional hypocrisy. It's like a doctor misdiagnosing a patient out of sheer arrogance, right? Ignoring the warnings of a specialist.
Yeah.
The patient dies a horrible, completely preventable death. And the hospital's response isn't to fire the arrogant doctor or overhaul their safety protocols. Their response is to simply delete the dead patient's existence from all medical records, so their success rate still looks like 100%.
That's horrifyingly accurate.
And then they force the specialist they ignored to quietly clean up the morgue. Regardless of the political system involved, what does it say about human institutions in general that the reflex to protect the institution's image is so often stronger than the basic human urge to acknowledge its victims?
It speaks to a fundamental, deeply unsettling flaw in how massive institutions operate. An institution, by its very nature, seeks to legitimize its own existence and preserve its authority.
Yeah.
When a failure is so massive that it threatens that core legitimacy, when it exposes the absolute incompetence of the leadership, the institutional instinct is almost always to hide the failure rather than learn from it.
To save face.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Acknowledging the victims of Banqiao requires acknowledging culpability for their deaths. And for an institution that relies entirely on projecting infallibility, culpability is an existential threat. Therefore, the victims must be erased to protect the system. It's a dark reality of organized human power.
And that reality brings us squarely into the modern day. Because the Banqiao Dam was rebuilt.
It was.
It stands there today. If you go there, the water is calm. The rebuilt structure has a proper spillway now. But if you visit that valley, there's almost no public memorial acknowledging the staggering loss of life. There is no massive monument to the 240,000 people who were erased in the dark. Most of the world, and even millions of people within China today, remain entirely unaware of the Banqiao Dam disaster. The 30-year silence was horrifically largely successful.
The physical infrastructure was eventually repaired, but the historical record remains intentionally fractured. The silence really is the loudest thing about the rebuilt Banqiao Dam.
Which brings us to the end of this incredibly heavy, profound journey.
Yeah.
We started with the ideological hubris of the 1950s, the arrogant desire to conquer nature and build an iron dam as a pristine symbol of political perfection.
We saw how that failed.
Right. We met Chen Jing, the lone voice of mathematical reason, whose desperate pleas for 12 safety gates were dismissed as too conservative, costing him his career. We traced the tightening noose of the freak storm, Typhoon Nina, stalling out and dropping a year's worth of rain in a single day.
We visualized the wave.
The sheer, terrifying kinetic energy of a 6-mile-wide wave erasing 62 downstream dams and countless sleeping villages. We confronted the horrific aftermath, where delayed relief, administrative paralysis, and toxic inland seas caused over 100,000 people to die of starvation and disease.
And I covered up.
And finally, we uncovered the chilling 30-year silence, the deliberate state erasure of 250,000 souls, simply to protect a political narrative.
It serves as a profound historical lesson. It is a masterclass on the extreme dangers of suppressing expertise, the absolute folly of treating physical nature as a political adversary, and the terrifying capacity of powerful institutions to hide their greatest sins from the world.
It really is. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a lingering thought. A question to mull over long after you finish this deep dive. We look at the calm reservoirs, the standing buildings, the complex functioning systems all around us every single day. We drive over massive bridges. We trust our power grids to keep the lights on. We assume the algorithms governing our financial and social lives are fundamentally safe, mostly because they are quiet.
They aren't currently failing.
Right. But Banqiao teaches us a terrifying universal lesson. Silence isn't always proof of safety. Sometimes silence is just the heaviest blanket thrown over a catastrophic mistake.
That's a chilling thought.
The question for you to explore is this. In our modern, hyper-connected, deeply data-driven world, what other warnings from today's experts, whether in climate science, artificial intelligence, or global infrastructure, are currently being dismissed as too conservative or politically inconvenient? What glaring foundational flaws are being quietly patched over with PR spin, just sitting there in the dark, waiting for their own proverbial typhoon to expose the cracks?
That is exactly the right question to ask. Because the physics of failure, whether it's the raw kinetic energy of water pressure or the compounding mathematical errors of systemic risk, are incredibly patient.
They don't care about PR.
No, and they don't care about politics. They will always wait for the storm.
Thank you so much for joining us on this intense, incredibly important deep dive into the echoes of the past. Until next time, keep asking the hard questions, look past the PR spin, and never, ever assume the dam is unbreakable just because someone put the word iron in its name.